Welcome to Pour Temecula, a local wine, beer, and beverage podcast. Your hosts, Rick DeLucio and Shannon Cole, are diving into Temecula's vibrant wine and beer scene. Today, we're kicking off part one of a two-part conversation with Temecula Valley Wineries author Rob Crisell. His deep knowledge of Temecula's past and present offers a fascinating look at how this region evolved into the thriving wine destination it is today. Let's dive in. Welcome back to Pour Temecula. Or if it's your first time listening, thank you. We're your hosts, Rick DeLucio and
Shannon Cole,
coming to you from the Quail in Old Town Temecula in Temecula, California. So if you hear some background noise, that's why, because other people here are drinking. So Shannon, what have you been drinking lately?
I actually had a really interesting dessert wine last night. It was made from the Mission grape in Paso Robles, and it was a Solera-style wine.
A Solera-style Mission grape, so almost like a sherry.
Yes.
Was it, what way was it like a sherry? Was it that nutty?
It was nutty, butterscotch, caramel, maple syrup. It was delicious. Interesting. Because right now we actually have a glass of Mission grape from here in Temecula, but we'll get to that later. What else have you had? You had to have more than that. I did, yes. Yeah, we went through a tasting of California last night. I was in Orange County, and we tried a Zinfandel from Paso. That was 150-year-old vines.
So it was an old vine night.
It was an old vine night.
Ah, interesting. What else?
We also had a white wine, if you want to call it that, but it was a mix of 150 different grapes from Georgia, the country. And half of them were not even identified yet. So that was a fun little experiment.
150. So how did they get to that number? They're just guessing.
There's just guessing at that point.
There's no way. All right. Anything else?
That's been the majority of what I drank this week. Last week we did the Vaux wine tasting over at Two Travelers, and they had a blend of Cab Franc and Petit Syrah that was delicious.
I can confirm that was delicious. That was really good. Lots of eucalyptus in the nose of that one, and kind of dried herbs. It was really different for Temecula.
Yeah, interesting blend choice too, but it worked.
I have to admit, when I first saw it on there, Cab Franc and Petit Syrah, I was like, really? Can we just have a Cab Franc? Which he does. He does make each one of those separately too. But amazingly enough, the two blends, the two grapes work really well together as a blend.
It did.
So I would recommend people go out and try that at least and see if you like it or not.
Yeah. What about you? What have you been drinking?
So this past weekend, I was down in San Diego. Went to two kind of larger tastings. The first one was at Vintage Wine and Cellars, which is near Miramar Base.
Okay.
Off Mira Mesa Road, I believe. And it was a Super Tuscan tasting. So not one specific vintage, just several different wines that they had in stock that were Super Tuscans. And I'm sure we'll have a show that'll talk about Super Tuscans here in Temecula later, but Super Tuscans can be 100% Sangiovese, they can be 100% Cabernet, 100% Merlot, whatever it is. It can also be total blends that include or exclude any of those grapes. It just is, it's a really international style too, usually, rather than being kind of old world in style, being more... They use more French oak in the Super Tuscans, and they don't necessarily go along with the laws of Italy, which is how they became Super Tuscans. That was very nerdy, but what I'm trying to say is there were some delicious Super Tuscans, like a really good one. One I had from 2016, it was a multiple 96, 98 point type of wine, and it was... fabulous. I'm trying to look at my notes, and my notes say it was the Mazzi Siepe blend, and it was a 50-50 blend of Merlot and Sangiovese.
Ooh, almost 10 years old too.
And it is drinking amazing. I may have got a bottle We won't say what the price was on that. And then after that, I went down to Vino Carta, which is kind of the natural bar hangout of San Diego.
Love that place.
Yes, everybody loves that place. And they had a fairly large Burgundy tasting. And while it was mostly centered around white Burgundy, Chardonnay, Aligoté, and a Blanc de Pinot Noir, which was an okay wine. It reminded me of a flat, sparkling Blanc de Noir. So I kept waiting for the sparkles, and they weren't there. But there were some really interesting, very natty wines, very funky, as you would expect from a natural wine bar.
Always fun.
Vino. Yes. That I just didn't really appeal to me. Other people found them more interesting. But I found a couple Chardonnays that are really a Petit Chablis, and then I'm going to mispronounce it, even though I wrote down it's a Châtillonnais, which is an area between Champagne and Dijon. And it's a small area, but as you would expect with some climate change, it's getting warmer, and they're able to ripen grapes pretty fully
Interesting.
nowadays. I only knew that because I had no idea where it was at, and I asked the guy pouring. I'm like, "What the hell is this?"
I wouldn't have known either.
And so he explained it to me, and then I went home and I Googled it like everybody else does. So that's what I've had. So let's switch gears here, and we'll talk a little bit of Temecula wine history. So in the interview that's at the end of our talking here with author Rob Crisell, we talk about the Mission grape, and Shannon just mentioned the Mission grape. She knew that. It's the Mission grapes that are here in Temecula are planted on the Pechanga Reservation. And you might have heard of it in Chile. It's called País, Listan Prieto, in the Canary Islands in Spain. I think there's only like 20-some hectares left planted, and it's really, really old and gnarly there. And then it's Criolla Chica elsewhere in the world. Argentina calls it Criolla Chica. To no surprise, it gets its name in the United States from the missionaries that went around and planted it, specifically here in Southern California, up along the coast, San Diego, Los Angeles. And some of the oldest vines in California are from the Mission grape. Not all of them produce grapes anymore, though. But you said you had one in Paso.
Yes.
So was it from Paso?
It was.
It was?
Yeah.
The wine that we have here today from Joseph Wiens, who used to make the wines at Wiens Cellars before another family bought it, and it's still named Wiens. He somehow got access to these grapes that were still on the reservation that had been restored, I think maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, somewhere in that range. And he made a dry red wine from those. In the past, Hart Winery and Briar Rose Winery here locally in Temecula had made a sweet wine. I'm not sure they still make that. I'm not sure how many people have access to these grapes anymore, but we have one. So what do you think of this wine?
It's really light in color. I don't know if I'd quite call it pale, but
yeah, it's hard to tell. We don't have stemmed glasses. We have stemless, so it's a little hard to tilt it, but I would definitely say it's on the paler side.
Yeah, it's very fruit forward with some, if you want to call it, earthy undertones.
Yeah, floral too.
Yeah,
really floral. Like getting the hibiscus. It does have a little bit of I don't know how to not woodsy aroma, but there's like maybe a mushroomy
I was thinking like a cedar or some sort of earthy, something you'd find in a forest.
Yeah, foresty, earthy, little savory, but definitely worth checking out solely because these vines were planted, they believe, starting in the 1880s, or some of the surviving vines. And of course, those get restored over time, but the oldest ones are from the 1880s, which is just super fascinating to get nearly 150-year-old, not wine, but source.
Yeah.
And it's pretty, I think, special to California and parts of the New World that don't have a lengthy history like, you have in Europe and Italy and France. And we still have these vines. Amazingly, they have survived. We're just lucky enough to still have them while we do.
Yeah, I love that this, comes from just down the street from us.
One of my goals is to actually go there and check them out, take some photos. Maybe I can do that before we release this podcast. And
oh, yeah, I want to go.
We can post them on social media for people. Or at least we'll get in contact with Weens and find out a little bit more, and we can post some more of that online. Just to wrap it up, before we listen to Rob Crisell's discussion on the first part of Temecula history, also the second episode, which is part 2 of our discussion, my discussion with Rob, it will just lead off with him kind of diving into Temecula wine history. So hopefully this history discussion has whetted your appetite for our discussion with Rob Crisell. Cheers.
Cheers.
I'm here with writer, teacher, attorney, actor, wine grower, and historian Rob Crisell, a longtime member of the Temecula Valley Wine Growers Association. Rob holds a WSET Level 3 certification and has called this region home for most of his life. He's witnessed Temecula's transformation from a pioneering cattle ranch into a thriving wine and tourism destination. Today, we're diving into Temecula Valley's winemaking history in his latest book, Temecula Valley Wineries. Rob, welcome to Pour Temecula. Is there anything I missed? Did you save a choking child on the way up there?
No, that is it. And thank you for the very generous introduction, Rick.
Yeah,
glad
no
to be here.
At all. Really happy to have you here, since you literally wrote the book a book.
There are a couple the latest book, we'll say.
Can you share more about your connection to the region, how it became such a central part of your life?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in nearby Fallbrook, which is just 30 minutes away, and was there in the early 80s. And so we would come over to Temecula, and Temecula was a little bit of a joke back in the early 80s. There was a little old-timey Western museum in Old Town. There was literally one stoplight in town. And so, but it did have a movie theater, and it had a restaurant on the duck pond. And so we would go there before prom, maybe for dinner. And they had a football team in 1990. So we would go play their little football team at Temecula Valley High School. But otherwise, it was just a little podunk town that no one knew anything about, and it had just changed its name from Rancho, California to Temecula. When I came back from school when I came back to live here after having gone to school back east and living back east for a while, I came back in 2003. And in that, say, 14 years time span, Temecula had completely changed. We had a mall. We now had 50,000 people. Soon we would have 75,000 people. And there were all these new wineries. So the wineries had sort of been dusted off because they'd gone through a crisis that we can talk about in the late 90s, and they had kind of recovered their bearings and were starting to be a thing. Pechanga was building its big casino. And so suddenly, seemingly overnight, Temecula was not just a place you pass through on the way from LA to San Diego. It was a legitimate destination. And it just built on that momentum until the present day.
Was wine always part of that? Or was it always part of your life? When did wine become a bigger issue for you?
Well, growing up, my parents enjoyed wine. They're native Californians. They grew up in LA. And so we would have wine for dinner. We, meaning my parents, would have wine for dinner. I remember my sister was a bit of a teetotaler back then, and she would give my parents a hard time about drinking wine, but I never had a problem with it, although I didn't really like it. And my dad had a collection of sorts. And so we grew up a little bit with wine. I went to Napa for the first time with my dad when I was 21. And I basically served as an Uber driver because I didn't like wine. I was in college. I liked beer. But it was beautiful to see all this passion when it comes to wine, because it was sort of like the liquid art. You know, people were were as intense and passionate about wine as artists are about their art. And that intrigued me, I remember at the time. But it wasn't until I moved to Temecula in 2003. My wife's a physician, and she had completed her surgical residency at Georgetown University. And so we happened to move back. We happened to move back to the same town, more or less, 30 minutes away from where I grew up. And it was this entirely new town. And the person who hired her is a guy named John Piccone. Now, John Piccone is all over my book because it turns out that John Piccone was not just a urologist hiring my wife, but he also owned one of the early wineries. He also helped found the Cilurzo winery. It was originally, people don't know this, the Cilurzo Piccone winery in 1973. And he's an Italian guy from Pittsburgh, has made wine his whole life. And so he invited us over to a greeting at his house in Fallbrook, where he had a little winery there. He had retired from the winery business, but he still had his own winery in his house. And I remember him making me try his Chardonnay. He kind of just had disdain for Temecula grapes. He'd gotten it from Santa Barbara. And the way he talked about that white wine, and I didn't even think I liked white wine. At that point, I was $2 Chuck, and I was discovering that red wine was pretty good. But there was something special about that Chardonnay. Lightly oaked, it was so aromatic and fresh and young, and just the way he talked about it, something clicked in my brain. And I started going to the wineries, and I remember going to Mount Palomar. That made a big impression on me in 2003, 2004, 2005. Mount Palomar was kind of a very, I have to choose my words carefully. It was a popular winery back then, and people liked it. And I kind of started to go to these different wineries. But in 2003, 2004, there were like 25 wineries, and some of them were really small, and they were still with the mom and pop. It was much more of a mom and pop culture. But that was, I guess, to answer your question, that was my experience with wine. I didn't drink wine in college. I really didn't discover it until my early 30s when I moved to Temecula.
So really, as an adult,
as a
later, out of college, an adult, when you had money,
right? Well, maybe so. Yeah. Eventually, $2 Chuck was not good enough.
Didn't cut it anymore. So then, how do you make the leap from being resident and kind of wine tourist, who happens to live here, to writing a book about Temecula Valley wineries?
Well, that's a long period of time in between, 10 years or so. But
so you've been working on this book for a bit then.
A bit, yeah, exactly. Because I gave this book a shot in 2014. I should say. So 2003, 2005, I started working as an attorney briefly, and then a commercial real estate guy with Lean Associates, a place in town. And we were going to client dinners and going to conventions, and so wine was being served more often. And I started to have preferences. We never went up to Napa again. We never went up to Paso. But a lot of our friends in town were very into wine. And so some of them took me under their wing, brought me to these different wineries. And so I started to really choose, wines more selectively and enjoy certain wines more than others, and see the faults in some of the Temecula wines and see some of the great things about Temecula wines. So it was in about, I want to say 2012, 2014, when I took a step back from my real estate business and went into writing and teaching and all those other things that you mentioned at the start of our talk.
And wine growing.
Yeah, because my job was essentially paying for our nanny. My wife's job was extremely intense. And so we had to make a choice. And, thank goodness for me, I guess, I did have a writing background. And so it also melded with a lot of childcare at that point and cooking meals. And so I was able to craft out a few different careers in place of the one I had, I guess you could say. And I started talking to some winemakers. And I developed a friendship with a guy named Craig Larson, who was the longtime winemaker for Callaway Winery. And I had a couple more meetings and dinners with John Piccone, and I developed a friendship with Phil Bailey. And I realized there hadn't been a decent wine history on the area in a long time. And so I started talking to about 20 different landowners and winery owners and winemakers. And I started to send out proposals to publishers. And nobody seemed to be interested in wanting to do a wine book on Temecula. There had already been one in 2009 by Rebecca Farnbach, a friend of mine, called Temecula Wine Country. Many of you have seen it, kind of a sepia-toned cover, and it sort of details the early wine country, especially from the perspective of the Cilurzos, which sort of co-wrote the book with her. And so I put that project on hold and did a bunch of other books. I wrote a children's book, novel. I wrote a book on Shakespeare. I got into acting, and then COVID came. And also I moved into wine country. So I was living over in a place called Meadowview. And then in 2012, we bought a property in wine country. I guess that's prefaces.
Yeah,
I suddenly was in wine country.
Very ingrained.
Exactly.
In friendships and living here.
Yes.
It was your community.
And I planted 2.5 acres of Syrah and Sangiovese on this new property that we had. And that really put me in the middle of wine country. And I joined the Temecula Valley Winegrowers Association. I joined the Small Winegrowers Association, which is led by Tanya and Greg Pennyroyal and Greg Rager, and discovered this amazing community of winemakers. And I was not a winemaker, but I was a wine grower. So, and I started selling to the wineries. And then COVID came along, and the wineries started not wanting to buy my grapes. So I was selling to Somerset, I was selling to Maurice Carey and a few others. They just didn't want to buy grapes anymore. And I didn't want my grapes to be lost. So I called up John Piccone again. The guy who sort of jump-started this whole thing back in 2003. Well, now he's 84 years old, 81 at that time. And I said, John, can you teach me how to make wine? And he said, okay, but this is how it's going to be. And he laid down this long list of ground rules, like I was a medical resident, and he said, you're going to have to come over at 6 a.m. and do punch downs, and you're going to have to do what I tell you to do, and it's going to be serious. Because he takes it very seriously and very passionately. And so I said, yes, sir, I'm going to do all that. And so I started making wine with him. At the same time, I started writing a wine column for a local newspaper. And eventually, there was enough momentum between my winemaking and my wine writing that I said, I'm going to start this book again using those articles as a basis. I pitched it to a publisher. And now Temecula, suddenly, 10 years later, roughly after 2012, was a thing. Mm-hmm. And we also had 47 wineries now. And so they said, sure, do this new history. And it's because it's part history book, but it's mostly a sort of guidebook and introduction to the wineries, restaurants, and the other things in Temecula. So I wrote this book, and that came out in 2023, and I've been trying to sell it. It's carried in a bunch of wineries, and I have Carol and Phil Bailey, mm-hmm. who wrote the foreword to it, and it's been a really enjoyable project.
Did the format change? So you've laid this out pretty well. It's for those who are listening right now and are looking at it, it's kind of a 5-part, which I really think is more like a 4-part. But the first part goes over the wine country's history. The second part are really about the wineries themselves, and Rob breaks it up between the Rancho California wineries, which if you don't know what we're talking about, Rancho California is a road, and I would say there are probably 20 some wineries, maybe
on Rancho California.
On Rancho California, just off that stretch alone.
Well,
or the little roads that kind of
the roads. There might be as many as 33 or so on that road, and its little tributaries, and then the rest are on De Portola Road.
And then he has the other section is on De Portola Wine Trail, and that is a good dozen, I'd say now.
Yeah,
possibly. And then he has a section on dining, which I would recommend to everybody, and then other things to do around Temecula. Did it just naturally fall into that format for you, or was it something you collected all your notes, put it together, and said, this way works.
Yeah. I did some thinking about it, of course, some planning, but it also was part of a series for this publisher. So it kind of fit into their series. And I looked at Virginia wine country and Texas wine country. And I sort of probably stole a bunch of different, aspects of that format from them. But, I think this works well. I put it into the De Portola wine trail and the Rancho California wine trail, which are really not things,
No, they're not.
They're not really things, but the De Portola wine trail has its own association. And sometimes we try to say, well, it's like the Silverado Trail up in Napa, but I get it. It was a little bit arbitrary, but I liked it in that it sort of divided the wine country into more bite-sized pieces.
Yes.
And there are, I'd say, different personalities generally in the De Portola wine trails, for the most part, wineries versus those more established ones. But really, it was just a way of organizing the book.
Okay. What I think is really fascinating is that Rob actually takes some time to walk us through a really deep history that I don't think of wineries and wine country in general that I don't think even many of us know. Talk about the early days, pre-prohibition up to about the 1960s.
Sure.
What was wine country like?
Sure.
Was there a wine country?
Yeah, and of course I was benefited by Rebecca Farmbach's earlier books, but there hasn't been a lot of history, and her book was in 2009. But wine country, you could say, started with the missionaries. San Luis Rey, Temecula was they call it an asistencia, which is like a submission of the main mission at San Luis Rey. So was Paula. Paula's mission, Asistencia, is still there, the church there that you can see. And so what the main mission was doing was having, say, cattle ranching and maybe some vine growing in Temecula, a lot of vine growing, fruit growing in Paula, and then they would take it back to the mother mission and turn it into wine. And so we do think that there was...
And this is about the late 1800s?
Right.
Early
So
1900s?
the mission... The San Luis Rey mission was founded in roughly 1799, I think, 1800, and it lasted only until about 1840, 1850, before it was confiscated basically by the New Mexican state and given out to all the nobles. But in that time, the missionaries accomplished a lot in terms of fruit cultivation, and grapes were one of them. Unfortunately, there was only one grape, and it was the mission grape, which is called Listan Prieto, and it's just a very minor grape. You can still find it apparently in Spain, but it's not a good grape. It's not considered a fine wine grape, but it was better than nothing. So it was used for sacramental wine, but it was also used for table wine, and especially for Angelica, which is a sweet dessert wine that was very popular back then. And so we can still find old mission vines around the area, most particularly in Pechanga, on the Pechanga Reservation, because some very early people, say in the late 1800s, early 1900s, seem to have gotten hold of those mission grapes from somewhere, probably from San Luis Rey, and planted them on the mission reservation. And that's just amazing to me, not the Pechanga Reservation, because you can still see the descendants of those vines in different places on that Paula Road as it empties into the Pechanga Reservation. So Greg Pennyroyal, Jim Hart have managed to preserve some of those, and they still make Angelica from them in different wineries around here whenever they can get them. But I just think it's amazing because you had that, then you had these French and Italian people coming over in the late 1800s, moving out to places like French Valley in Temecula and all over the valley. And French and Italians, they love their wine. And so they began making, some actual European Vitis vinifera wines. And during Prohibition, we have evidence of that. They were selling it to Murrieta Hot Springs Resort, which was a big deal back in the 20s and 30s. And so we know that there was a lot of wine growing and wine drinking up to
and the Mission grape in particular. I've had some versions from Portugal, from the islands. I forget what islands, but it makes a rather. If you think Pinot Noir is a light colored wine, Mission generally makes a very pale colored wine that doesn't really get up high in alcohol. And what I found interesting when I moved here 8 years ago, and soon thereafter heard about these vines, is I believe they're some of the oldest vines in California.
I
think
believe
there
that.
is and Mission vines as a whole are the oldest vines.
Oh yeah,
I believe in California. There is one outside of LA that I think
there's
is,
San Antonio Winery. There's Galliano Winery. It's up there in Corona and Ontario. People don't realize that that area, where at the Ontario airport, there were thousands and thousands of acres of vines. That really this beginning of California wine country begins in LA, begins in Riverside County, and it was much bigger presence until Prohibition and until post-war, and then all that agriculture was taken out for Prohibition, but also because of just building. That's where people moved, and so wine country really began to migrate north. But we had a little presence down here in Temecula, so that was the beginning of it. But then soon after, you have to fast forward, and really no one was growing grapes again. This area became a cattle ranch. The Vail Cattle Ranch. Vail was a guy from LA, and it came out here, and this was this old Spanish land grant, which was Paba and Little Temecula. There's 60,000 acres or something like that, was all for cattle and granaries. And then Vail sold it to a big development company, the Kaiser Aetna company, in the late 60s. In fact, my father, who was a real estate developer in San Diego in the mid 60s, he said he was trucked up here in a bus with a bunch of other young agents from USC and other places. And they were let off right at the duck pond in Rancho California. This is 1966.
Was there still a duck pond there?
There's always been natural springs there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it actually did have ducks.
Well, I don't know about the ducks. Yeah. It was a pond. There were lots of ponds there. People don't realize that those ponds, they're maintained now by people.
Yeah.
But those are natural springs.
As long as I've lived here, it looks like a rather constructed
water
but
this whole area was lousy with springs and lakes and everything. And then Vail, dammed up Vail Lake and created that. And so it stopped the flooding of Temecula Creek, which was good. But there's still these springs around. Anyway.
So how do we go from all that cattle ranch? What happened in the 1960s that really changed?
So what really changed was they needed to sell houses because, as I was telling you, my dad would come up here. The guys couldn't wait to get back on the bus. They're saying, we can't sell houses here. This is the middle of nowhere. There were
and I should point
1,500 people.
From my understanding, there was also no interstate that connected Los Angeles
through
Riverside County.
There was a little road that would go down probably.
Yeah, not like we have today.
Rainbow.
A mega 10-lane highway. There was no highway.
There
were highways, of course, but not that connection had not been built yet.
No. So there was no infrastructure. And so it was too early for a big development. But this Kaiser Aetna development company was starting to sell off lots to developers and other people. And what they did was in 1966, they hired a UC Davis viticulturalist named Dick Brake to plant some demonstration vineyards around the valley. So there was one planted where Carter Estate is now. There was one planted where Ponte is. There was one planted roughly where Somerset Wineries. And there were a couple others. And what they did was they planted one row of Mourvedre, and then they planted one of Cab, and so you had one block, say 40-acre block, might have 25 different varieties in there. And they did that around the valley. And they just wanted to show, and they planted citrus too, and they wanted to show people that this can be a really beautiful, bucolic agricultural lifestyle. Build your house here, have your acreage, get out of LA and San Diego, because that was a time when people were trying to escape those cities. And they also wanted to show that you could grow fine, wine.
Did they
grapes.
irrigate then, or was it just natural, whatever rain, or from Vail Lake?
No. Well, irrigation was just at early stages. I mean, it was with steel pipes and everything. They
probably were doing small 1 or 2 acre plantings.
But I have to believe that they were irrigating it.
Okay.
Yeah, they were irrigating it. And so people discovered that, and people in Ontario, a guy named Bian, he was an Italian immigrant who had created these wonderful wineries up in Ontario area with all that acreage. He was running out of land. That land was becoming too expensive to cultivate. So he bought, I want to say, 400 acres, roughly where Ponte and Botaya are, because Ponte family bought it from him later on. And he planted a bunch of acres of grapes that he was going to use for his wineries up there. And a guy named, Audrey and Vinny Cilurzo. Vinny was a lighting director in Hollywood for the Merv Griffin show and for Jeopardy. He came down in 68. He said, I'm Italian. I like wine. And he planted at the same time, roughly, the first commercial vineyard, kind of at the corner of where Calle Contento and Rancho California is. It kind of planted out that. And those are some of the oldest vineyards in the area. And so all of a sudden, we were starting to get some interest and infrastructure, but these were all dirt roads still, for the most part. And nobody was coming to wine country. These people were not the idea was not to make a winery. It was to grow grapes and sell the grapes somewhere else. And that was a model that would really persist for the next 20 years almost. But the next two people to come in that really transformed Temecula was Ely Callaway, who did Callaway Winery, and John Poole.
And we know Callaway from
the golf clubs.
From the golf
clubs.
Right.
But he was first at Burlington Industries. He was this titan of clothing manufacturing back east, got a golden parachute buyout, came out here, was wandering around. He says, I like wine. He met a guy named John Moramarco, who was planting these vines for Bian and for the Cilurzos. And the legend has it that Ely Callaway had this big chunk of money. He said, well, John Moramarco, where would I have a winery here? What should I buy if I had all the money in the world and I wanted to put the perfect winery in? And he pointed up at the hill where Callaway is now and says, right there, best views, right at the entrance of what will be wine country, plant there. And so he bought 100 acres or so, planted it out. Soon after, a radio titan, a guy who owned a bunch of radio stations, John Poole, came in, said, I'm going to do what he's doing, bought land right next to him, had John Moramarco plant out his, and all of a sudden, within short order, you had about 1,000 acres planted in Temecula. And that was all by the end of the 60s. So that was the start of it. But they were making grapes, for the most part, to sell for a while, to get some income. And eventually, Callaway put a trailer up there, and he started making, with the help of a winemaker, started making wine. And John Poole was the first to say, well, we can sell this wine to people who come in. We can make these wineries a destination. These are dirt roads, coming out there. And so that tourist business was very slow to start. And
I'm sure.
And in fact, John Poole and Mount Palomar was the first to really open to the public. Callaway was making wine for distribution. And so we really weren't a winery region the way you think of it today until the mid 80s. So anyway, that's a long way of telling you how it started.
I didn't know the connection before I moved out between Callaway Golf. I just thought it was a common name.
No.
And I've seen Callaway wines from the 70s appear on different auction sites from time to time.
They're no good anymore.
And they're probably no good. but a fascinating thing, for $15 or $20, you collect it and it just sits there.
Yeah.
And you have a cellar or whatever you have, a little display, and you're like, look at this wine from 50 years ago.
Well, if you had to point
but
to
I did
founder,
heard reading in different people talk about Temecula online that the early wines from Callaway from that era were rather enjoyable for their simplicity and perhaps sweetness.
Yes. I mean, it was a different era. Think of it, he made a wine, a Riesling, for Queen Elizabeth.
Yes.
For the bicentennial. So it was a 73 wine, but it was served in 1976 to Queen Elizabeth, and she had, which is amazing. Think of even today, a Temecula wine being served to
let alone a Temecula
Prince
Riesling,
Charles.
which I don't think.
Well,
if you talk to most people here, they don't recommend growing.
The 70s and 80s, that was a white wine time.
Yes.
And so I think at one time Callaway had this slogan, because he was an incredible marketer. He had his whites are all we do, or something. Temecula became a white wine region. And that's largely because of Ely Callaway. He didn't love reds. He liked whites. And people in general in America liked sweeter whites. We were coming out of kind of sherry and some sweet wines, dessert wines, and think white Zinfandels in the 80s. That's what we were drinking. And it wasn't until the French paradox, the idea of the red wine being good for you, those studies and reports that came out in the 80s, where people did this switch, where they went from, but we were a white wine region. In fact, I read, and I've talked to people like Peter Poole, who's a historian, he's the son of John Poole, and others who have said that something like 80% of Temecula's grapes were Chardonnay until like the late 80s.
Well, I don't even think people plant Chardonnay now.
But Chardonnay, Riesling, the first block of vines that Vinny Cilurzo planted in the 60s, late 60s, that was Chenin Blanc and Petit Syrah. But really, Italians were drinking red wines. Everybody else was drinking sweet and white. Yeah. So I think that's fascinating.
So when did that change? Who spearheaded a change to being more serious wines and driving sort of it as a tourism destination place?
Right. Well, Ely Callaway certainly put us on the map, and Temecula Callaway wines. He made 300,000 cases one year. So we don't even do that today. There's no winery out here that might produce more than 45,000 or 50. So he was doing 300,000 cases. So he put us on the map, but maybe not for the right reasons sometimes. And people associated Temecula with cheap white wine sometimes. Eventually, people like Joe Hart, who came in 1980, and Phil Bailey, who was here in 86, and John Piccone, who was partners with Vinny Cilurzo in 73 when they first opened that winery, the Cilurzo Piccone winery. Then Piccone opened his own winery in 1980. We're starting to get a few more people who liked red wines and believed in red wines. So you start getting cabs for the first time. Syrah, I think Mount Palomar was the first to do Syrah. Peter Poole took over from his dad and started producing better wines with the help of Etienne Caupur. And John Piccone was buying wines from Napa and other places and making them. So suddenly we're discovering some red wines. Then in 1976, there was the Judgment of Paris, where our reds, our cabs in California, Napa, beat the French cabs, and our whites won as well. And all of a sudden, people were getting more excited about these wines. So Bill Filsinger was an early guy in there, although he did like white wine. But I think the late 80s wineries were growing grapes to sell to Callaway. And then secondarily, they were selling them to wineries in LA, in Northern California, and other places. We were a grape export area. But then Pierce's disease came around in 97.
That wraps up part 1 of our conversation with Rob Crisell. If you're eager to learn more about Temecula's winemaking history, be sure to check out his book, Temecula Valley Wineries, for a deeper dive into the region's rich past. Before we go, I wanted to mention a fascinating connection between Temecula and one of the most iconic beers in the world, Pliny the Elder. Vinny Cilurzo, the legendary brewer behind Russian River Brewing Company, is the son of Vince Cilurzo, co-founder of the Cilurzo Pechanga winery Rob just mentioned. It's now known as Bella Vista. Before launching Russian River Brewing Company, Vinny made his mark as the original head brewer at Blind Pig Brewing Company, which he co-founded in Temecula in 1994. It was there that he brewed what's considered the first commercially available double IPA, pioneering the bold, hop-forward style that would later make Pliny the Elder. So in a way, Temecula played a key role in shaping craft beer history. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to Pour Temecula and leave us a review. It really helps us keep the conversation flowing. Follow us on social media for behind-the-scenes content and updates on upcoming guests. Until next time, keep exploring, keep sipping, and cheers.